Welcome to Backyard Oasis, a podcast designed by and for older adults living in the beautiful Pioneer Valley of Western Massachusetts and produced in the tech studios at Greenfield Community College in Greenfield, Massachusetts.
Hello, this is Christine Copeland of Backyard Oasis. Today I'm delighted to speak with Anjali D'Souza, the Manager of Engagement for the Smith Botanic Gardens, a collection of plants from around the world that are not only for students to examine and be amazed by, but also a fabulous resource for the Pioneer Valley residents. Also joining us for this podcast is a volunteer docent at the Botanic Gardens, Bill Copeland, who has been leading tours here for many years. Anjali is a native of Louisiana with an extensive academic history at Smith and the University of Massachusetts and other institutions. In her new role at Smith, she works to build campus and community partnerships that foster environmental and social justice through teaching and learning about plants, people, and place. You can learn more about Anjali through the links at the bottom of the podcast. Bill also hails from the South, originally growing up next to a park with a creek and small nature museum in Charlotte, North Carolina. His first job after college was a teaching position in a small Midwestern natural history museum. From there, he went on to do graduate work in ecology and public health before choosing medical school and pediatrics in our valley. Now retired, he is a docent at Smith Botanical Garden and leads tours for adults and children. So, Anjali, Smith Botanical Garden has many ardent fans. What makes the Smith Botanic Garden a special place to so many people?
First of all, thank you so much for having me. And I love this question as a starting point because since I've only been in this role for about 15 months, I've had the opportunity to meet many of our visitors, whether they're staff and faculty here who have raised their kids and thought of the Botanic Garden as an extension of not just their workplace, but also their homes, as well as community members from across up and down the Connecticut River Valley. And what I think makes it such a special place is that a lot of people do feel like it is an extension of their own backyards. I think we're really fortunate in New England to be protected in many ways, at least for the time being, from some of the impacts of climate change. We experience these 4 seasons, but folks have access to a range of climates in our 9 public-facing greenhouses at any point in the year. We're always open to the public. We're almost open every single day of the year. And so it's a space that you can just be here on your own. It's also a space that you can bring grandparents or aunts and uncles, visitors who are coming from afar. And I hope it's a space that we continue to express as welcoming to all community members.
So when you talked about the 9 public-facing greenhouses, were you referring to greenhouses around the valley or here?
I meant the rooms in Lyman Plant House. So we have 12 greenhouses, or glass
rooms.
houses, rooms.
Yeah.
The student-facing greenhouse is only for students.
Yeah.
And then we have we have warm genetics and cool genetics, which are more or less production and kind of care-taking spaces that our horticulturist and curator, have plants in, and many of those plants are actually dormant throughout the year, and they rotate depending on what time of the year it is. But Bill, I'm sure, can say more.
Well, no, I hadn't counted the 9, but yes, it's a maze in here. And when I first came here in the late 80s, it was as a respite, from work. And I came by myself, and you can't really get lost, but you certainly can go from room to room and see a lot of different things plant-wise. And of course, the rooms that are off limits to the public are interesting, peering through the glass to what's going on back there. It makes you realize that this is not just for show. It's for learning, and so it wasn't long after. It was when I came back to the Valley after a couple of years with Public Health Service that I started to bring groups here myself, students that I was working with sort of on a volunteer basis locally, that I knew that this would be an interesting place to come to. So that's been doing that.
You had a very sweet story about some of those rooms and children peering through the doors.
Yeah. Well, it's because a lot of kids ask about Venus flytraps, and for a while there, they were all back in the rooms without public access. So I would kind of get in low tones, say, well, we're going to go over here and open this door, and I'm going to go in, I'm going to bring one of these out, So I'd bring them a specimen of Venus flytrap to look at up close and then put it back.
And you as an educator, Anjali, what do you think of that as an experience for children to just learn about those sorts of,
Yeah, I think it's absolutely crucial that we find ways for students to visit us and to maybe even in some cases go out into community and visit schools maybe at some point down the line, because as a former middle school and high school teacher, the curriculum and the methods of teaching are really they're really decontextualized. They're not on the land. They're not of the land. They're not really even in some ways honoring the relationships that communities have with each other and with land, which includes our more than human relatives. For various reasons, there's a lot of explanation, a lot of 20th century and 19th century history of science education in schools that really informs how teachers are trained today and the ways in which curriculum is written. And so when a student asks, about certain carnivorous plants, or when a young student, I mean, Smith students too, but when I'm thinking of Bill, I'm thinking about seeing him a lot of the time with our K through 12 groups. We have a responsibility as folks who are passing along this earth to them, and they are going to have to kind of live with the consequences of our actions as a society. We have a responsibility to nurture and to just support their meeting these plants and getting to know who the plants are, what climates they come from, what their migratory histories are, what their uses are for humans, and also what their kind of roles are in the ecosystems that they are either native to or their roles in the ecosystems that they've been migrated into. And so, in my opinion, it would be wonderful if we could reach every K through 12 student on a regular basis. And I think that the conservatory is a unique place to do some of that teaching. And we have to do it in tandem with, knowledge keepers and scientists, as well as folks that are coming from diverse epistemological backgrounds, so different ways of knowing and being that honor also and value cultural knowledge and intergenerationally transmitted knowledge.
Mm-hmm. That's really fascinating, and what we're talking about is your mission to foster environmental and social justice, at least partially, justice through teaching and learning about the plants, people, and place. So, have you been hired to initiate changes in this, or is there a pivot or a shift in perspective that is the reason that you were hired? And if so, can you speak to that?
Sure. I will do my best to speak to that because I have a sense of what conversations were had before I arrived. I know that my position as manager of engagement did get articulated as a desire and then codified in our racial justice action plan, which was for the Botanic Garden, which was written about 2.5 years ago. And I don't think of my role as the role that initiates change. I think it's one part of like a change, a paradigm shift, I think, that was already starting to be, starting to coalesce. And also, it's not like we don't exist in a vacuum. Like what's happening in the Botanic Garden at Smith College is like people noticing what's happening in the world, people having relationships with people beyond the Botanic Garden, and thinking about how do we reckon with the fact that this Botanic Garden, like so many 19th century Botanic Gardens that were also based on, the naturalist and kind of expeditionary collecting that is, part and parcel of transatlantic colonial and imperial movements. How do we reckon with like the fact that this place exists and we have such a rich economic botany collection because of those structures of power? And how can we use those histories and the like histories of the people who had who continue to have very intimate relationships with some of these plants that we in our very capitalist, just the ways in post-industrial ways in which we relate to one another don't have easy access to. We have like the world at our fingertips, right? By having the internet and being able to Google search or now use AI to like synthesize mass quantities or mass volumes of information. But I mean, today we hosted a kindergarten class.
Wonderful.
Which was lovely. It's the campus school, and it's a class called Leaf Study, and that class has been going on for I think about 20 years or close to 20 years. There's a really interesting kind of history of the origins of that class, but the class is taught between a faculty member in the Education and Child Studies department with students who often do become education majors focused on elementary education and go on to become teachers themselves, and the kindergarten class and the kindergarten teacher. And just kind of seeing... you will like this. You will appreciate this.
And
we
I
were
will ask
using
him.
microscopes today, and I was a little skeptical of kindergartners using microscopes. That's not something that I had experienced in my teaching in middle school, in public middle school, but
I love it.
the wonder and the description and the ways in which they actually haven't been socialized to ignore, or they haven't been socialized yet not to express their curiosity, is really, I think, what we need
As adults.
as adults and as a society. Like, we can't just close ourselves into, these climate-controlled buildings, rooms where we're facing the computer all day and not recognize the Camperdown elm and like what that interesting history is, or the ginkgo tree, or some of the houseplants that we think of even as like backdrop and not our more than human roommates.
Yeah, so these multiple perspectives really set up a way of telling stories within stories. And the inner story, can be whichever one you choose. If it's the history, and then you come up to the current moment, what's known about this plant, scientifically, but also you can weave back in the story of how it was known to indigenous people before it was brought to the attention of the Western world, which a lot of these plants have such stories, and they're not all known. But when you know them, they make a great story within a story.
Can you give an example of that?
Well, the one that I probably tell the most often is the ipecac plant, which I knew ipecac as a medical resident and in pediatric practice, because it was syrup of ipecac was available as a way to make a child, regurgitate, a toxic substance. But this plant was encountered by the Portuguese at the knowledge of the indigenous people who showed them this plant and told them what it was for, which was to treat amoebic dysentery, because the essence of the plant roots is toxic to the amoeba, but it has a terrible side effect, which is to make you throw up. And the Portuguese took it back and mixed it with opium and some other things and made a medicine out of it. It was wildly popular, and of course it was probably misapplied terribly, because first of all, there wasn't that much amoebic dysentery in Europe, which is what it really treated, but people liked the opium, and it did have that one useful property that made it into the late 20th century, and then finally decided the side effect was too. It wasn't good for it wasn't safe really, so they stopped making it. But we have the plant, and I like to tell people that the ipecac word, ipecacuana, which is the specific name of the plant, is the indigenous word for roadside sick-making plant.
So on that note, Bill, you give tours to groups of various ages, and you might talk about this plant to a grandparent coming, or maybe a group of older adults who are listening to this podcast, or you might tell that story to children using, it's the same story but using different words. So how do you change your approach to groups of different ages? Like, does that just come naturally, or do you?
Well, I think the kids get, you can kind of, their minds are opened when they get here. And when you can use some novel words or novel ideas that they don't hear every day. So a couple of things that I like to point out is that plants, such as the ones they're seeing, even though they live here under our care, they're wild. And so they have some characteristics of wild things. They protect themselves, and they, have to carry on their life cycle, and sometimes use the help of other components of the ecosystem that they live in. And so that's the starting point for talking about things like pollination or toxic chemicals that are protective, or just the shape of the plant, like why is a vine, it's got an advantage, not having to make a big trunk. It can go all the way to the top of the canopy. So there are a lot of stories then that of plants sort of having some of the same qualities of any struggling being, that's got to make its way in the world.
So, Anjali, to get back to the different age groups, you have docents here, and a number of your docents, not all your docents, but a number of your docents are retirees and are a little bit older. And I'm an older adult, and I think I would love to have a tour by another older adult, because I also am somewhat botanically blind. I mean, I less so now, of course, after years with Bill, but there's so much to learn, and all ages learn a lot about animals, but there are just certain groups that really learn a lot about plants. And I loved how you were talking about plants and integrating them with the larger world, not just of people and cultures. And but why don't we just start with my first question, which is talking about the older adults who are docents, and also what programs there are for maybe older adults who come here with their children or grandchildren.
Sure. So I hadn't previously managed or kind of coordinated adults the way this role requires, working with our docents, our community volunteers, also called docents. And I love every month getting to meet with them and beginning to kind of, so first of all, I will say that like everybody on our team, all of our docents have such specialized knowledge. Many of them won't like kind of admit or think of their plant knowledge as specialized, but they do have specialized knowledge. And many of them also have had very rich careers that intersect with plants. So we have some folks who actually were, instructors of botany or who are master gardeners. But we also have, doctors, and we have a mathematician, and we have folks who can think about plants in these like really unique ways because they're applying some lens or maybe multiple lenses from their lives as like maybe retired adults, but also in their professional careers or in other roles that they have. And so I'm constantly learning from them. I really enjoy the conversations we have, but kind of thinking or like kind of stepping back a little, one thing that really attracted me to this role in a way that I found lacking in teaching public school or teaching school in general is that we really do segregate folks by age throughout their lives, right? Like it isn't, I mean, we do it in a hyper, focused way in K through 12 and even in college by, having grades and, there are only occasionally mixed grade schools, but we don't like encourage, right? Intergenerational groupings unless it's within a family. But even then, like how often do grandchildren see their grandparents unless they live in the immediate vicinity? And there's something that's really lost actually in having not just survival blueprints in this day and age, but having like an understanding of navigating the world, the human world, as well as like our relationships with the more than human world. And I will say that I had to, in my adulthood, realize that, and it was through befriending 80 and 90-year-olds as I got a little past my 20s, and I was like, oh my gosh, I never thought of the world in the way that they've described it. And that worldview is informed by the experiences they had in the 1940s or the 1950s. And what if more of us knew about that? Because then we wouldn't take for granted, or we wouldn't only defer to this very presentist way of seeing the world. And so I think that it's really important that our K through 12 visitors get to learn from our docents, whether they're like retired or not, and that our docents get to learn from each other.
Wonderful.
You also, asked about like programming that we have so that, folks from different generations can bring the young people in their lives here. We have different exhibitions and different engagements throughout the year. Right now, our Bogsies, our Botanic Garden student educators, are working on a number of really interesting projects that aren't just limited to within Lyman. They're also doing some like, I don't remember the word, but it's like mapping. They're using like ArcGIS to map some of our native plants throughout campus and to tell stories actually beyond those plants names, because it's not enough to just like be able to say, oh, that's this plant, or this is the common name and this is the Latin name. But how do we like not just assign like a monetary value, but how do we recognize that plant in its wholeness? Because once we see it for who it is, then it's really hard to unsee it. Like once you recognize like a family of, a particular kind of tree, you see those trees all the time. And then when they get sick because of some kind of, like beech leaf disease or Dutch elm disease, when that happens and there's such a widespread loss, or like you can tell that one or more of those plants or species, because if a plant is sick, it often has implications for the rest of the ecosystem. Once you know that it's there and it's an important part of your everyday life, when you lose it, then you might be motivated to do something or to change something.
Oh, yeah, that's so true. We have sassafras in our forest, and they're such lovely trees because of the strange shapes of their leaves. And we have porcupines that love sassafras. So there's that tension. And having learned about, well, having seen the porcupine destroy the sassafras in the yard is one thing, but also having seen them down in the wildlands, just, it teaches you about all the different interactions of the forest and how they can be perilous.
Yeah. Well, getting people to bring their new understandings, if they're coming to the Botanic Garden and coming away with some new understandings, it's my hope that will give them a reason to be more responsive to the challenges that are happening now with climate and other things. So my approach, is partially to look at plants through time. I usually come into the Botanic Garden through the evolution hall and point out that the ancient earth, had a lot of different plants in the past that made incremental changes toward the kind of modern plants that we see today, flowering plants, and that this was very impactful on the climate through time. So there was, it's hard to unsee that when you know that there's been a great variation in conditions on the Earth's surface, and plants had a lot to do with it. Then you begin to kind of see that everywhere, and currently in our present circumstance. So we know that plants are a big part of the solution, natural climate solution.
And as you were saying, Anjali, everything is so interconnected because, you were saying that the plants affect the climate, and our built environment and our agricultural environment affect the forests and the plants and, corridors. And so when you start to understand those connections, the world does become bigger, even if you don't know all the particular species. You just begin to feel. I like the way you were talking about the other than human world. Was that the term?
The more than human.
The more than human world. I think that's sort of a way of seeing things that's emerging a little bit more, and I think that probably speaks to the difference in botanical gardens too, where you start seeing the connections more. Is that what you meant?
Yeah. So this expression, more than human world, is in a lot of indigenous science literature, because in many indigenous communities and cosmologies, there is an inherent understanding of relationships over objectification and the human as the center.
Right.
And I mean, you Bill, translated that medicinal plant. Can you repeat the name of the
Ipecacuanha. It's Carapicha ipecacuanha is the scientific name.
Yes.
And the ipecacuanha part came from the indigenous language of Brazil, because they knew this plant before the Portuguese
And
arrived.
remind me what it translates to.
Roadside sick-making plant.
Yes. So in many indigenous languages, this is also kind of the subject of my dissertation research. The names of what we might call objects or even animals or plants in English are often descriptive, or they translate into what that one does.
An action of some
Yes, so there's like a lot of verbs, and this is like I'm not an expert. I'm not a linguist, but throughout many languages, indigenous languages throughout the world that are like much more closely, in which communities are like just much more in relationship to the land, and so I guess I bring this up because we are such a like. The way our language has evolved is really human-centered. It's really human supremacist, and it's really noun-centered and objectifying. So, like, we even make verbs into, especially in, like, the 21st century, we make verbs into nouns. I'm trying to think of some examples. It happens a lot in, like, marketing and business, I
that
find.
we're podcasting right now.
Well,
No,
yeah.
I guess that's a verb.
Yeah, that's a verb. But, like... I can't think of any right now because I try actually to rid myself of the.
Yeah,
But
well, there are examples. I think there is some effort now, instead of naming new when things are discovered anew, giving species names to discoverers or friends of yours
Yeah.
or something like that. There in at least a few instances that I can think of. The names are chosen from indigenous languages because they, in a sense, are the context from which that species, is or the human context that they come from. I think of that, the name for the first tetrapod, that was discovered as a fossil, Tiktaalik, and that's from the Inuit language. They chose that. They got together and were asked to provide a name, and that's what they came up with. I don't even know what it means, but it's basically says something about what this thing did when it lived.
I think, though I wasn't familiar with that example, that's your example, Bill, speaks to this paradigm shift that was already, or that
Underway,
is
yeah.
already underway.
Yeah.
And the Botanic Garden, because we are in a liberal arts college, because we're in a historically women's college, that like really focuses on research, conservation research, and other types of biological research, like we are impacting some of that paradigm shift, and we're also reacting to it. It's like this ongoing, oscillating. Yeah.
Especially if you're working with young people.
Yes.
For whom this is just new. I would like to ask you a question, Bill. When you have kids who come into the garden and both of you are just sort of thinking about this, sort of enlarging their sense of the world, what are some of the surprises for them, do you think? Where do they you see them opening their eyes?
Well,
asking questions?
every room, every room of the greenhouse, the 9, we sometimes get to, some certain of the rooms are especially popular, and they're kind of sense opening, not just eyes, but your whole senses become aware that you're in a different environment. When you walk into the Palm House, you're going from a cool hallway into a very warm, moist environment. And where in the world do you find such a place? And then you get into the geography. This is an equatorial, regions are like this with constant warmth and light and humidity. And, of course, plants love it in those conditions. And look at this room. It's full of very lush plant growth. And you can begin there as to what human impacts are on tropical rainforests And other rooms, the desert room, people love the desert succulent house because the plants look so strange. They're
Right.
leafless, they're covered with spines.
That's just what I was thinking. They're so different from what we know.
Yeah,
in New
and
England.
that's a clear, ecological, evolutionary message that, plants, if they're going to live in this place with abundant sunshine that helps them grow, they need to protect themselves against what the challenges are, which is, shortage of water.
And if I could just add to that, I'm thinking about the ways in which certain plants are instructors or teachers to us and to students, young people. One of my predecessor, or my only predecessor, I guess, Gabby Immerman, often says, if you walked outside and you saw a dinosaur, you'd be like, wow, you just like freak out, right? But we see these huge older trees, right, all the time, and we're not necessarily jumping up and down and thanking that tree for like continuing to serve our ecosystem, to offer us shade, to be habitats for like all these other insects and mammals and birds that we rely on and we loved seeing. And so when I think about the ways in which this kind of land-based education or plant-centered education can get students or get young people to like give them permission to like not be limited by the human supremacist ways that we're like already really socialized to participate in. I'm really optimistic that they can change. They can, I don't know to what degree, but that it doesn't have to be as dire as rising temperature change increases. That with enough recognition and enough recognition of the plants themselves and the other, beings that we share this earth with, but with enough recognition that we can learn from them, they have adapted, they have survived, they have kind of withstood these really harsh conditions.
They really have, and and there are some great stories out there in the collection, or in the in the grounds at large on the campus. The Metasequoia tree is a great one, because not only is it a spectacular specimen of a tree, but it has a great story of its it being revered by the few people who saw it in the very limited area that it still existed when Westerners became aware of it, and it was such a surprise to them because it was previously known as a fossil, and it was described. The fossil was described before the living plant was, and when they realized that they were one and the same thing, a cascade of other realizations followed, which is that was a tree that actually occupied the Arctic at one time in a great forests of Metasequoia, and dropping their needles and leaves and branches into great mounds of fossils that are still found up there. So it was living in 6 months of darkness, and at a time when the world was a lot warmer.
Bill has told me about the tours that he gives to children through that hall about deep time, and he talks about the lichen or the moss or I forget, but
yeah, talk about the difference in the ways that plants disperse and carry out their life cycle to make more of their kind, and the original way of reproducing on terrestrial plants relied on spores, which were very minute and totally vulnerable, and how that life cycle involving spores living, creating a tiny plant that had to live independently, to putting the spore equivalent, which is pollen, into a much safer position on another plant, that is the flower of the plant, and then it would be protected, and that became this fantastic form of serving the plants, or creating a new generation with a seed that's protected and has a package of energy to go with it. That was much more reliable way to disperse and carry out, keep plants on the landscape with seeds.
Resulting in all these gorgeous flowers.
Yeah. Those are the flowering plants. All the flowering
Yeah.
plants make seeds.
So just learning that story opens your eyes to the New England landscape that has those. It has the early plants, the
The ferns,
lichen,
and they're all
and the
throughout
ferns.
the whole greenhouses here. The ferns are everywhere because those spores float through the air and they land in a moist crack, and we have ferns, coming up here and there, just popping up on their own because of those spores.
But just learning that story opens your eyes to our landscape because we have examples of those different periods in time. We have the lichen, we have the moss, and then we have the gymnosperms, and then we have, the evergreens, and then we have the flowering plants. And so just that, what I could see would enable a child to see the forest in a completely different way, not just in the present, but through that long time.
Yeah.
What you call deep time.
Yeah, there's one plant in the mural of deep time that is a very close resemblance to a living plant. So, and I pointed out because we can then see it later on in the greenhouses that is the whisk fern, which is a Psilotum. It's a spore-bearing plant that looks a darn lot like the very first things to crawl out on land. It's a living fossil.
And Bill actually presented on one of the ferns, the
Isola.
yes, the fern that is in many of the cemeteries of New
that
Orleans.
one, yes, that one too. Yeah.
Which was really touching to me. So we have this, professional development aspect of our monthly meetings, and for part of that, docents, present on plants or present on something that they are very passionate about. And I was very familiar, having grown up part of my life in New Orleans. I was very familiar with the imagery that he shared with me, and I'm also very familiar with many of the ferns.
Yeah, which we happen to
Lyman.
have. The same ones that grow the cemetery fern.
Yes.
From New Orleans is here in the greenhouses as a volunteer fern.
Yeah.
That's living in the walls, cracks in the walls here.
But his presentation was particularly heartwarming for me because moving to New England I moved here from Brooklyn, but moving here in the middle of January was really tough for me. And so I often found refuge in Palm House, because as soon as I go into Palm House, similarly, as soon as I exit Louis Armstrong Airport in New Orleans and the humidity hits my skin, I feel very at home.
Comfortable, yeah. Yeah, there are a lot of kids that have that. They remark on it.
Yeah.
Say, oh, I like this.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Well, I think we've covered quite a bit of ground. I don't know if there's anything that you wanted to add, but I guess I would like for you to say, I want to thank you and Smith College for making this resource available to all of you, to the general public, as just a wonderful place to come and maybe experience an environment that is not the New England environment, but maybe one that a student from far away can recognize. But also, yes, for other people in the Valley to come and learn these things that you've been describing. When can people come? And
every single day, 9 to 4. I'm here, during the week. So
So even
they
on
want-
weekends. Yeah. so
Saturdays
that's
and Sundays, yeah.
great for families.
And-
you'll encounter a docent, most likely,
Yes.
right at the front desk.
We're so indebted to our docents who really are, in many ways, the public face, especially on the weekends when there are fewer staff members. I often do pop in on a weekend because I walk to work every day and I like to visit and say hi to the docents and to my colleagues. But one thing that we didn't get to touch on, or two things, I guess. No, one thing. One thing is that we do a lot of student programming for Smith students and co-hosted with student organizations and houses and unity groups, et cetera. And so we have this really amazing ongoing series called Food as Medicine, where during later hours for students only, we introduce them or reintroduce them to a plant from which we as humans get food. And we learn about the migratory histories, the sociocultural histories of that plant, their medicinal properties, what other plants they're related to, and then we serve them a dish, or maybe the first Food as Medicine was papaya. So we had papaya plants. We did have fruit. They weren't really big enough for us to eat, so I bought papayas at like the co-op and at Trans International Market. But just bringing students into the greenhouse in this after-hours setting so we can get to like recognize and share really and kind of recapture some of the relationships maybe our parents had or our grandparents or our ancestors had with those plants, and share recipes and share stories. That has been really just this wonderful experience over the last, I'd say, 6 or 7 months. I'm very much working with student groups on that. And then I also want to acknowledge that there's a lot more that we as an institution can do at the Botanic Garden in welcoming and making our spaces accessible to everyone in the community. So as we are, looking at our communications, particularly our language offerings in our materials, I welcome conversations. I welcome folks to consider becoming docents in our next recruitment phase, which will be in the fall again, because I think that we should have, if somebody comes in and like wants to talk about this plant, for example, from Haiti or from the Middle East, and maybe they only speak Haitian Creole or Arabic, like we should have a way of being able to recognize and welcome the knowledge they bring and have a conversation about it.
Yeah,
Well, as a former employee of and now a volunteer at the Greenfield Community College, which is sponsoring this podcast, the classes with Teresa Jones and Anthony Reba would come down here in the middle of winter, when there's just so much you can see in the botanical gardens up there. So that is certainly has been much appreciated by that institution.
Yeah, I think Tony's coming next week.
Oh, is he?
I mean, I'm giving him. I'm signed up for his tour.
Oh, okay.
I'd love to meet him.
Yeah.
Oh, good. Well, absolutely. I'll put in. Yeah, I'll touch base with Tony. It'd be nice if you could meet him because he's doing a lot in their gardens.
Yeah, we get some requests sometimes for specific regions, particularly like Caribbean, Puerto Rican, sometimes Asian, plants that would be especially relevant to people who are interested in the cultural connections to plants for regionally.
All right. Well, Bill and Anjali, thank you so much for this incredibly interesting and informative discussion, not only about the Botanic Gardens, but about some very strange plants and education in general of all ages, for people of all ages in this wonderful place where they can come. Thank you.
Thank you.
This concludes today's podcast. We're always looking for new ideas, so feel free to reach out to Judy Raper, Associate Dean of Community Engagement at Greenfield Community College, at 413-775 1819 if you have an idea you'd love to share. Special thanks to the creators of Backyard Oasis, Denise Schwartz, Chad Fuller, Dennis Lee, and Christine Copeland. Have a great day.